Thank you so much, Jay Bhim, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I wanted to think a little bit, given this, the significance, I think, of the Cisco case, what I think will be a precedent-setting case. I wanted to think more broadly about the ways in which the series at the AKSF has focused on starting to think a little bit about the question of first and foremost, translating caste discrimination into the language of racial discrimination in employment, which is what is at the heart, in some sense, of the Cisco case and some of the other cases that are coming up. But I think this has also rightly opened up a broader conversation about the two categories of race and caste, their differences, but also their interconnections. And I just completed also reviewing Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, the book Caste that just came out a couple of weeks ago, which again makes a set of fortuitous interventions, fortuitous given the time that we're in, just as some of the debates were taking off, I think, within the South Asian community about caste in the South Asian diaspora. And that book, of course, makes an interesting set of arguments about prioritizing caste for actually thinking about the longstanding history of American racism. And so I think it's quite interesting to think about that book in the context of some of the other conversations that South Asians have been having, South Asianists. We've all for very long been trying to make the argument about the significance of caste, its political nature, its deep impact and imprint for thinking about the history of democracy. And here we've suddenly got a kind of, a globalization of caste, as it were, through somebody who uses caste to rethink the category of race. So I want to kind of think about this, the back and forth dance of race and caste, and I'll try to come back and speak a little bit about its longer term history. But I thought it was quite fortuitous that we're having this conversation today, given what's been happening in our broader sphere. And so what I want to do is to begin by briefly sketching some of the dominant ways, or some of the domains, I should say, of social and political inequality, so that we can start thinking about the nature of resistance and resistance against caste within the South Asian context. And then I'll try to think a little bit about the globalization of the caste question in some sense, but also the very productive ways in which race and caste have a long-standing interrelated or interwoven history with each other. Right? So we're at a distinctive and distinct conjuncture where there are new openings and possibilities for thinking across difference, thinking across political solidarity, thinking around new political solidarities, and thinking across political difference. But we're also currently in the midst of an unprecedented assault on our basic institutions of parliamentary democracy, whether we're thinking about India or we're thinking about the US, where we are. This moment of danger, of crisis, is of course always good to think with. And it begins to clarify contradictions, it reveals continuities, and it marks some sharp breaks. So in terms of today's conversation about historicizing resistance, one might simply begin by stating the obvious, that there is resistance everywhere that there exist institutions of control. So there are material constraints which are a little bit easier perhaps for us to challenge because we can see them, but of course it's the ideological constraints, the psychic orders of exclusion and inequality that are the hardest to think through and indeed to challenge. And as far as anti-caste thought goes, and so I want to think about anti-caste thought and anti-caste activism around the question of resistance and the distinctive forms of resistance that they produced historically. So as far as anti-caste thought goes, it seems to me, first and foremost, a double move that almost all anti-caste thinkers make, certainly in the modern period. That is, they have to think through the ancient orders of exploitation and historical violence, what we may call the question of Brahmanism in history, something I know Gajendran will speak more about, speaking of global Brahmanism, but this question of the ancient order of exploitation, Brahmanism in history, and the way in which it begins to coexist alongside modern categories of transformation and the modern ways in which caste itself comes to be transformed. That is, caste's relationship to empire, to capital, and to other institutions, modern institutions of governance. So in some ways, the archaic and the modern come together right? And we have to think or rethink history and its relationship to the future, it seems to me, in a very particular way for anti-caste thought and anti-caste thinkers. And this is why so many of them, we can think about Phule, we can think about Ayotidas, we can think about, Ambedkar, of course, and many, many others. This is the reason, it seems to me, why for almost all of them, the focus on rewriting the history of caste and reclaiming personhood become such significant sites of resistance, if we're thinking about the question of resistance. And more broadly yet, I think the question of claiming the right to intellectual labor and mass intellectuality, right? That which actually the system, caste, if you think of it as a system of intellectual and manual labor, that being the fundamental divide, just as, we can think about the fundamental social divide in the way that Ambedkar tells us is the structuring divide between the untouchable and the touchable. Then this claim on the right to think, the right to engage in intellectual labor, mass intellectuality, I think becomes one of the most significant sites of resistance and the ways in which anti-caste thought actually begins to rethink categories, right? So that, the idea of a kind of ideological formation, challenging caste hierarchy, challenging both the archaic and the modern orders of caste, is actually about rethinking some of the categories that we use of description, of understanding and analysis. Right? So let me just briefly sketch out, I think, sort of three major domains, as it were, where we can begin to think about the ways in which anti-caste thinkers, anti-caste activists really engage this question of resistance. So what are some of the domains where we can think about the forms of resistance, just so that we can get a sense of what's happening in terms of the activism around challenging categories, but also really challenging conditions of everyday life, challenging material exploitation, challenging conditions on the ground. So I'll briefly speak about the religious, the political, and the social. And then you'll tell me I've got maybe another 20 minutes or so, is that right? And then I'll speak a little bit about caste and race to the extent possible, if that's okay, yeah? So just the religious, I just want to briefly mark out some of the things that are happening in terms of resistance in the domain of the religious. One is a focus of resistance across millennia from bhakti devotionalism as a kind of internal critique of Hindu religion, you might say, to the very large questions of conversion, Christianity, Sikhism, Islam, all of which begin to be predicated on the idea of human equality and an ethic of recognition, something unavailable within Hindu religion, which Ambedkar, of course, describes as legalized class ethics. And if we're thinking from the perspective of the Southern and the Western country, as it were, it seems to me that Buddhism as Dalit religion becomes the predominant way in which resistance within the domain of religion is actually operationalized by anti-caste thinkers. Now, the arguments for Buddhism, of course, drew on colonial and Orientalist ideas about comparative religion, and also about the history of religion as a kind of developmental unfolding of religion itself. We could think about something like Hegel's, universal history, the unfolding of Geist or spirit, which culminates in the German Protestant state for him. But really, this focus on Buddhism, I think, is quite significant in terms of thinking of resistance within the domain of religion as such. The focus on Brahmanism, of course, here is also significant as a distinct social order governed by religion. As I said, Ambedkar's point about Hinduism as class ethics, but also his use in some of his later writings, the distinctly modern and distinctly Marxian category of revolution that he begins to use to speak of this violent transvaluation of values, Buddhism to Brahmanism, the epochal conflict, as he reminds us. That structures the very possibility of historical thinking and the history of the subcontinent. And this, I think, is surely quite significant to think about. And of course, thinking about resistance within the domain of religion, we can think about less totalizing criticisms of religion as well, the arguments about bhakti devotionalism itself as effecting a kind of linguistic turn in medieval and early modernity, where the language, kind of language of love and submission, also becomes a way to rethink, in some limited sense, I suppose, the question of caste and caste hierarchy. So that would be sort of resistance in the domain of religion, broadly speaking. In terms of the question of politics, we tend to think about this as a modern field of action, But of course, the relationship of dharma and artha is a millennial problem. And we can think about it in some sense through something like the Bhagavad Gita in the Mahabharata as staging that problem of political ethics. Right? And it's not at all surprising, it seems to me, if we think about this text, that it's one that gets resuscitated by everybody in the nationalist period, from Tilak to Gandhi to Ambedkar. Right? They all want to see this as a text, a kind of, text of political theology, if you will, a text that's really speaking about political ethics, but has to do it in and through the question of caste itself as political. So the sovereignty of the Brahmin, the sovereignty of the Kshatriya, and so on and so forth, but that this is the domain of kind of resistance within politics, you might say. But if we come to the modern period, to the 19th and the 20th centuries, then the question of politics becomes a question about self-determination, about the franchise, and ultimately about participation in representative governments and using democratic institutions to produce equality. This, I think, is the fundamental question of caste and democracy, which is with us to this day. And I'll just mention a couple of things here. So one is the history of Indian affirmative action, again, very relevant to the Cisco case in terms of the translation of this, of the case and caste discrimination in the South Asian diaspora. But the longer term history of Indian affirmative action, I think takes root in some sense in two distinctive ways. One is through the question of proportional representation, and the other, broadly speaking, is about the question of the representation of the minority politics. And I think we should acknowledge this distinctive and distinctively subcontinental history of affirmative action. It precedes that of the United States by over a century, and it becomes the model for other imperial colonies as well. And the argument here goes very simply like this. The colonial census and other counting technologies opened up the social world to enumeration and categorization. It also opens up the possibility of thinking about number as ratio, as proportion. That is the proportion of one community to the other. Middle caste, dominant caste, historically, whether we're thinking again, I can speak as somebody who knows the South and the West a little bit better than the North, but across the subcontinent, really, we're seeing dominant and middle castes making a claim from the time of the imperial census from the 1870s, making a claim to proportional representation, i.e. they constitute the majority ought to be represented as such. But if we think, for instance, about the Dalit question, and Dalit representation, and we could think about Ambedkar, of course, as standing in for all of those innovations in a kind of theorization of politics, modern politics in India around the question of caste and democracy. Then the innovation that Ambedkar makes thinking about resistance in the domain of politics is, I think, still under-recognized, but let me lay out what he does. Ambedkar routinely uses, and this is part of the reason why he is called a British stooge by both the communists and the Congress, if you will. But Ambedkar routinely uses colonial committees and commissions to argue for the universality of the franchise, right? The right to vote as a universal right, as the fundamental organizing political right. He then begins to make a set of concerted demands for separate representation. That is a separate electorate, for instance, Pune Pact and so forth, as a way to create a specific constituency that does not yet exist, right? That is that this is a destitute, dispossessed community that lacks political value. And how indeed are we to create political value for a worthless, so-called worthless political community? This, it seems to me, is the real challenge that Ambedkar faces in terms of thinking about a politics of minority, which is quite different from the question of proportional representation. Right? And the innovation here then has to be to think through the idea of political separation or exception as the way to think about the fullness of democracy itself. That is, until you can congeal Dalits, the so-called depressed classes at the time, as an interest group, through political conscientization, the realization of dignity and self-regard, you will not be able to fully represent their specific interests as also the interest of a significant minority. And I think this is the radical democratic project right here. Until the most subaltern claims the right to politics, the idea of democratic equality is itself questionable. In fact, it's worthless. You can think about similar things happening in other spaces: the Haitian Revolution, slave insurrection, and the agency of the fugitive slave who takes up arms. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction writes beautifully about this moment in the American Civil War as the first moment, the sounding of Black freedom, right? And these are all, it seems to me, part of an expansion of the history of democracy by subaltern thinkers, global subaltern thinkers, globally significant. Foulé recognizes, for instance, the American Civil War as a world historical event, though he also applauds Lincoln and sees the revolutionary heroes as being George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette, right? And we can, of course, think forward to Ambedkar's constitution, his constitutional insurgents, and the Indian Constitution itself is enabling a social revolution. The focus on group deprivation, the focus on the equality of outcomes versus just the equality of opportunity, which is the domain of American civil rights law, and the extensive imagination of the reach of the state in provisioning equality. Now, this is, rhetorically speaking, I'm not talking about what happens in terms of policy, but the document is far-seeing, right? And I think it should be recognized as such. And then, of course, there's the history of modern caste as both political, but also that it begins to be seen in policy terms as being class-like, as a form of socioeconomic deprivation. In some sense, we've talked about religion, politics, and maybe the specific forms of resistance that occurs within these domains. Come to the social question very quickly now. And I wanted to take up two questions. One, it seems to me, is the social question as the question of sexuality and the question of sex and gender, the inside, if you will, of social life, as what makes visible the social reproduction of caste. And this, I think, is a radical innovation and intervention by anti-caste thinkers, right? I want to suggest that our anti-caste thinkers were feminists first, right? So whether you think about Foulé, you think about Ambedkar, you can think about Periyar, you can think about Ayodhya Das, you can think about any, Tarabai Shinde, and so forth. But the very significant ways in which they see the intimate control over sexual reproduction as being the absolute grounding conditions for understanding the social reproduction of caste. This is a great innovation. This is an innovation in thought that I think really should be recognized, because they begin to connect the intimate order of person, if you will, right? So questions of desire, of sexuality, of intimate life, and so forth, as always already being significant for how we understand politics. Right? So that would be one way to think about the social question. And now there's a question of inequality, which is a social question as well, and the ways in which we might think about a political economy of caste. This, I think, is precisely where questions about class, exploitation, and about caste as capital and the control over wealth begins to surface. And I want to suggest that this is perhaps the place where we've had various kinds of interventions, but it seems to me that the political economy of caste is ripe for rethinking. This is actually a place where, if we wanted to think about histories of resistance, it seems to me this is a place where perhaps more work really needs to be done. So, we have the social democratic responses of including or trying to bring things like caste legitimized practices of degraded labor within the fold of economic calculus. Ambedkar does this from very early on by talking about the Mahar Vatan as a kind of free labor, as a form of free labor. And what he wants to do is to actually calculate, what it means for people to be engaging in various kinds of degraded labor. So we've got that, we've got leather work. We certainly have that with the question of sanitation work today. So how do we actually make degraded labor kind of not just invisible, but unimportant, disposable, remaindered labor? How do we actually bring it within the fold of calculus, right? And then there's been, of course, a long-standing debate about bonded labor and caste slavery, especially in the southern country, in Tamil Nadu and so on. But this is also the place where the debates about caste and class and about Ambedkar and Marx, it seems to me, has produced a very deep space of contention. And it is something that is worth thinking about. You know, we have, again, if I can think from Maharashtra, we've had a number of efforts by people like Sharad Patil and others, Kosambi does this somewhat as well, to think about the question of caste feudalism, right? To give that, that adverb, you know, of caste to the question of feudalism as a way to understand the sort of the universal history of capital is also the universal history of caste. We see Du Bois doing something quite similar. He talks about, and he constantly uses the qualifier abolition democracy to talk about what happens in the aftermath of the Civil War in the United States. Or he'll talk about social caste, or what he calls colored caste. Right. But, and this memoir of Dalit communist R.B. More, which we just published with Leftward Books, also begins to suggest the deep contention around this very precarious efforts to bridge caste humiliation and class exploitation. Or we can even think about Sujata Gidla's Ant Among Elephants, where what we're reminded of is that the most vibrant movements around labor, right, around questions of the peasantry as well as, you know, industrial labor and the working classes have been led by caste subalterns historically. But that there is also a very particular history perhaps of Dalit Marxism that we might wish to think about. And that is a very sensitive topic, if you will. It's a very sensitive topic for Ambedkarites. It's a deeply sensitive topic for thinking about the relationship between caste and class, partly because Indian communism has never made a place for understanding the heteronomy and the specificity of caste. Even though it is the question of caste class, the transformation of caste into class as a modern category, as caste becomes modern, one might say, which actually affords new forms and formations in politics. And so today we have, in many ways, also then the reverse, speaking about the divide between labor and capital. And this is the demand for support and recognition of Dalit capitalism. And I actually think we need to be working on both of these fronts, on the front of labor and of capital. And maybe I can now turn very quickly to the question of comparisons with race and use this question and the debates about racial capitalism as a way to maybe end with what I wanted to say, which is the kinds of connections between race and caste. So historically, we could think about, you know, maybe Booker T, but certainly the Garveyites, Marcus Garvey and others, the Nation of Islam, deeply invested in the question of Black capitalism, much like the arguments that are being made, I think, for Dalit capitalism. And we should take those seriously, rather than, I think, putting those aside as signs of false consciousness or, you know, aspirational politics and so on. Right? So the focus in around Black capitalism is really to talk about Black-owned business, Black-owned banks, and so on and so forth, as a way of actually building Black capital, of producing Black wealth, right? In the context where, as we know, even today, the ratio between whites and Blacks in terms of their access, their inherited wealth, is 1:10, if at all. So I think it is very important to work on both of these fronts. But, you know, the question about racial capitalism, I think, has gone much further than, for instance, the question about caste capitalism. So I just wanted to use some of the arguments around race and or rethinking caste from the perspective of race and sort of end with that. You know, Du Bois himself, going back to that great thinker, you know, Black Reconstruction, you know, written a year before Ambedkar's critical text, Annihilation of Caste, makes an argument about, and the text begins actually with the white proletariat. Right? And it begins with talking about the formation of the white proletariat, the Black proletariat, and then speaking to the great tragedy, the failure of the possibility that's opened up by the period of Reconstruction to actually lie in this failure of class unity between the Black and the white proletariat. Right? And so for him, white supremacy, what he calls the psychological wage of whiteness, trumps the possibility of thinking about sort of modern race, if you will, as actually modern race fundamentally organized around the question of labor and working class life, right? So it's the coming together in a sense of race and class that is fundamental to the ways in which modern racism operates for someone like Du Bois. in the conversation with Gandhi, certainly, Ambedkar begins to make some moves in that direction, where he challenges the argument about caste as an occupation, as a division of labor, by talking about the division of laborers. That is, by introducing significantly the divide between the touchable and the untouchable, as foreclosing the possibility of class unity. Right? But it seems to me that some of these debates within racial capitalism are worth thinking about. And then I wanted to end, do I have about 5 minutes? Can I take 5 minutes? Would that be all right?
Yes, that should be fine. Yes, thank
Great,
you.
okay. Yeah, so what I want to do then is, so to open up this question first of, race, racial capitalism, as maybe being one place through which we can come back to the question of caste and capital. But just very briefly also to think about this, since we've started by thinking about race and caste and their connections and the ways in which they're being interpolated today in the context of the South Asian diaspora, but then this important case, the Cisco case, and what happens in the aftermath of this. Could go back, I think, and think historically about the connections between race and caste. And one is, of course, the centrality of race, of course, for clarifying the conditions of caste power and inherited privilege. So we know that Phule, in Ghulamgiri in 1873, really wants to think about Atlantic world slavery as, in some sense, providing a very a clearer model of caste contradiction, right? And there it is about Brahmin, non-Brahmin. Ambedkar, of course, is not averse to thinking about historical comparison himself and will make use of the term race. But he's deeply distrustful of Phule's reliance on a kind of biological conception of race, as he would be of Dravidian conceptions of race, the Dravidian Aryan arguments and so on. So he begins to think about slavery itself as a system, as systemic, right? And so he thinks about and begins to make a different set of arguments. He'll make an argument, for instance, that the slave is at least conscious of his enslavement, whereas untouchability he calls an indirect form of slavery, and therefore much more pernicious, much worse, and much more difficult to actually do away with. He'll have a delicate dance, Ambedkar, with the question of race itself. I mean, he's writing, of course, at a time when, kind of Aryan racism, as it were, is on the ascendant. And so race for him is a very, very, and biological racism is for him a deeply contentious and troubled category. So he'll constantly sort of play with it, but move away from it. Even in Caste in India, he will begin by saying that, caste is not race. It's not organized around racial distinction. Caste is actually about a kind of unified society that produces artificial distinctions of caste as a form of social power, as a form of social rule. I think we have a sense of the ways in which race gets used by anti-caste thinkers, well into, things like the Dalit Panthers and so on and so forth, drawing on the kind of comparison and the analogies with American race and Black power and so on. But the use of the term caste, and Du Bois makes us aware of this, but the use of the term caste has a very long history. In American history, the use of the term caste has got a kind of long genealogy, I should say. So the Black church uses the argument about caste. Abolitionists are drawing on missionary representations of caste to describe race as an aristocracy of color. Charles Sumner's 1869 essay on race makes the comparison explicit, and he argues, and I quote, "The white man is a superior caste, not unlike the Brahmin, while the Black man is an inferior caste, not unlike Shudra, sometimes even the pariah." Plessy versus Ferguson, of course, uses the argument that law is caste blind. The NAACP uses and mentions the term caste. And then, of course, we get to someone like Du Bois, who makes an argument that he revolutionized the use of the term caste between 1910 and 1930. And I think he does this because he brings and makes the idea of colored caste or racial caste proximate to the material conditions of class, I would suggest. And so this long-term history of American caste, something that, for instance, Wilkerson draws upon in her own work. She takes recourse to the caste school of social stratification, which is, to my mind, a very weak school, so to speak. It's an argument basically about race relations. And it's interested in the idea of, how the social relations between Blacks and whites are reproduced right? And what prevents Black social mobility. And already, and it's interesting that, Wilkerson and Caste uses this and draws on this kind of history of the Caste school of social stratification from the 1930s and the 40s. She draws on Allison Davis, she draws on Gunnar Myrdal, whose American Dilemma draws on the term caste, and his book gets used by the Brown versus Board of Education. It gets used in the Brown versus Board of Education case itself. But this is a school that's really interested in the social reproduction of social relationships and how these perdure. But you're already having Black Marxism, some of the people that, Du Bois is going to be closer to, Oliver Wendell Cox, Eric Williams, certainly, who talks about race and slavery, and others, who are beginning to work through Black Marxism in order to think about the question of race and caste. Race and class, but using the term caste. Right? And so it seems to me that, going back and maybe thinking about some of these longer term connections, the interwoven histories, and the kind of long-standing conversation where race has been used to illuminate caste, but caste actually has been used to illuminate race, makes for a set of productive misrecognitions. It makes for analogy and analogical thinking, but it certainly doesn't make for straight on comparison. And so maybe it's, I'll stop here by suggesting that, race and caste are supplementary to each other. They are long-standing kind of twins, as it were. One used to, in some sense, both reference and illuminate the conditions of inequality and exploitation and discrimination of the other, but that each also has a kind of separate and distinct history. And if we are going to come back in the South Asian diaspora today to think about the relationship between race and caste, maybe having this broader sense of movements within India around resistance, historicizing resistance, and then also thinking about the comparison with race and caste is helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Anupama.